All right, welcome to the next episode of my NHL Deep Dive series. Today, we are talking about the Toronto Maple Leafs. And I know some people may have thought this episode was going to come a bit earlier. Some people might have thought they were going to be in the top five. Toronto ends up ranking number six. And uh, they're a team that is full of controversy when people talk about them, just based on the fact that it's Toronto. They're going to be, it's going to be a divided crowd on people's thoughts on this team. And I mean, overall, like this team's always been a very strong regular season team. And then come playoffs is when they've seemed to have their issues. And these rankings are based on what these players have done mostly in the regular season, because that's what the majority of the good data is from to evaluate players. Obviously, playoffs are a small sample size. We've been over this. I've talked about this in multiple videos. But I feel like it's important to say in this one because there's going to be the Toronto shouldn't be in the top 15 because they can't win in the playoffs comments, which is fair, I guess, to an extent. But like this team is a solid roster, and I don't think you can really refute that in the fact that this team is very, very strong, and they deserve to be in this conversation. They deserve to be in the Stanley Cup bubble. That's just they do. We jump into their offseason moves, and they didn't add any forwards. They're really hoping that some of their kids can come in. Easton Cohen is one of those guys who is going to get a look. I don't know if he's going to be full-time NHLer this season, but he's going to get a look. Robertson is another guy who needs to really break out and find that next step that everybody kind of thought he was going to out of the draft. Um, and Matthew Knies, of course, obviously played some top six last year. He's somebody who also needs to really step up into that top six. And that's kind of what they're hoping for. They didn't add anybody. They didn't really lose anybody either. They lose Tyler Bertuzzi and Noah Gregor. Bertuzzi is the biggest loss. And even then, like Max Domi was the guy that was more consistent throughout the season. They were going to sign one of them. Max Domi was the right move. Defensively is where this team really kind of shifted their blue line. I have them slightly upgraded, just because the guys they brought in aren't particularly young, particularly Tanev and Oliver Ekman-Larsson. They bring in Hakanpää as well, who's had his injury questions this summer. It's been kind of a weird situation with him. And they lose TJ Brody, John Klingberg, Joel Edmondson, who's only really there for the playoffs, Ilya Lyubushkin, who we just talked about, and I've given my thoughts on him, and Mark Giordano. So I have this group that's slightly upgraded. I think Tanev's the best player out of this group. And Oliver Ekman-Larsson's pretty close to being the second best player in this group. But outside of Tanev, there isn't really anybody who like is going to majorly shift the foundation of this blue line. It's mostly a lot of like bottom of the roster depth kind of acquisitions. They add Stolars, Louis Samsonov, and Martin Jones. I like the Stolars addition. He's one of the better backups in the league. Now we haven't seen him take on a bigger role in a couple years. So, in Florida, he was kind of sheltered a little bit, very similar to like what Brossoit was in Winnipeg, where his numbers were fantastic, but he really wasn't put into a ton of crazy situations. So I'm interested to see kind of he's going to take on a bigger role, at least to start here in Toronto, but we'll get into that more when we talk about the goaltending. Offensively, I have this team ranked fifth offensively, and most of that is due to the top end of this roster. I think depth wise is definitely the biggest question on this offense. But again, they have some of those younger guys that need to step up. Right, we just talked about Dallas video before this, and the difference between Dallas and Toronto is I think Dallas, if they get that progression from their younger players, it is just like an added benefit to an offense that's already very stable. Toronto, on the other hand, is a team that needs to get that development in order to be like a true contender. I think that's kind of the difference. So there's a bit more pressure in Toronto to get that next step from a guy like Matthew Knies or Nick Robertson compared to Dallas, where if like Logan Stankoven plays, doesn't progress at all, it's not really gonna like there's still gonna be a very good offense. Obviously, the conversation starts with Austin Matthews because Austin Matthews absolutely rocks. And he is one of the best goal scorers in the NHL. He's one of the better defensive centers. His two-way game is very good now. He's just kind of become an all-around player for this team. Now, getting the C is going to be an interesting wrinkle to this, and to see how that pressure kind of uh how he can handle that extra pressure. I think he'll be fine, but you don't know, right? It's kind of a up there question. We'll see if that ends up hurting his numbers in the regular season. We'll see if it benefits him. I don't know. It's one of those X factors that you can't really quantify at the moment. But it could become a factor at some point. It could be one of those things that gets brought up, especially like in the media and stuff. It's going to be a talking point pretty well the whole season. Moving on to Mitch Marner, and Mitch Marner's like the most interesting player here because Leafs fans have kind of turned on him in the same way they turned on William Nylander like 3 years ago. Um, and then William Nylander started to perform well in the playoffs, and now all of a sudden William Nylander is not a problem. It's really funny how that narrative has just completely flipped to Mitch Marner now, because that like 2 3 years ago it was William Nylander has to be traded because he doesn't battle for pucks in the corner in a like 5-1 game against Tampa Bay. Um, and now it's flipped. Now William Nylander rocks and Mitch Marner is the problem. So it's really funny how the narrative in Toronto seems to flip as to who's the blame for this team's issues, when in reality, like I talked about it in I think I talked about it in my first video on the channel, where I went over like what's next for the Leafs. And I think I mentioned it in there that like the biggest problem on this team isn't the top six, it's the bottom six. It's the depth on this team. This team doesn't have any consistent depth scoring. They're always trying to rebuild their identity in a completely different way in at the deadline compared to what they do during the offseason. And it's that identity crisis that's hurt them the last couple of years, especially in the Dubas era. Didn't see it as much last year, but last year the team was just kind of in a transition period, basically. So it's interesting that these are the guys who get blamed, because obviously the salary caps are big and everybody freaks out about that. But if you look at the depth on this team, like they're paying a lot of these guys in the bottom six a lot of money as well. I mean, like the David Kampf contract is brutal, and they've been doing that for a while. I mean, the Ryan Reaves contract is pretty brutal. So I don't even have him on the roster right now because he shouldn't be. But like, so it's those things are hurting this team just as much, if not more, than the big contracts are, because of the fact that like you're going to pay your stars money, right? But you don't have to pay your fourth line center David Kampf money, right? Like that's not necessary, and that's where the salary. It's those dollars and cents with these big teams that really get that can really eat up that salary, right? And that's the same problem that Edmonton's about to have, where they're going to you have to get every dollar value out of those bottom players, right? It's like Tampa Bay did extremely well during their cup run, during their back cup finals appearances, right? Where they were paying their bottom six like nothing, and they were getting extremely positive outputs from all those players, right? Like Toronto's not doing that. And that's really the biggest problem on this offense, right? Like people are going to point to the stars because that's easy, right? Like it's the easy thing to do. But and it gets clicks, right? Like blaming Mitch Marner is going to get you a lot more views than blaming, the David Kampf contract. So yes, like I'm not shifting blame away from any of these players. Like I think, like they need to be better in the playoffs for sure. But you look at all the teams that have won the Stanley Cup, and they have, very common themes. And one of those themes is the bottom six that can score, and that is outplaying their salaries. Toronto hasn't gotten that pretty well at all. So that's where this team's focus should be, and it really hasn't been. And maybe if the kids can step up, they can get that this year. But Mitch Marner is the big question because of the contract, right? Like, because he hasn't been signed yet and he hasn't been traded yet. So they're going into the season with this big like cloud over the team, where it's like, is he going to be here at the end of the season? Is he going to resign? Is he going to be here next year? And Mitch Marner is one of those players that you can't really just let walk, but you also, like at this point, it's gonna be hard to move him because that salary, like the closer you get to the start of the season, the further you get into the season, the harder it is to move, like money like that. So it really sets up this very interesting scenario where they might end up just keeping him as like their own rental and then letting him go. Or maybe they throw a bunch of money at him and resign, right? Like there's so many variables here at play. And obviously, the Tavares money, coming off the books right away is going to help. But it's a fascinating situation, and I'm shocked there wasn't more like concrete rumors about what was going to happen to Mitch Marner. And obviously William Nylander's there as well. They're both A players. They're both top, near the top of the league in top tier wingers. And like if you followed the Leafs at all, like you've heard so much about all these guys, and that's why I'm focusing more on the narratives than the actual individual player analysis in this video, because I think that's actually the more interesting story, right? Like everybody knows Mitch Marner is a really good winger. Everybody knows William Nylander rocks. Everybody knows Austin Matthews, one of the best centers in the NHL. Like we don't like those have been pushed down our throats forever. It's the narrative on this team that's more interesting and that's more intriguing. Um, you dive around the rest of this roster, right? Like I talked about Matthew Knies, who needs to, continue to develop, who they need to develop on this team. Calle Jarnkrok is somebody who you'd probably rather have on your, third line, but here he is potentially playing in the top six, right? Max Domi now has just started playing. They've paired him back up with Marner. So maybe he gets, that the top six left side of this roster um is very malleable. There's a lot of moving parts. So you can, like don't be beholden to these lines because I guarantee you they're going to change even before opening night. But Max Domi is somebody who had a really strong season last year, who I've really liked forever. And if they can get good production out of him again, then hey, that looks really good, and it makes the Josh Anderson Montreal trade look even worse as the years go on. But that's a whole other discussion. Um, and yeah, I mean, depth wise, like Connor Duar's there. He's fine. David Kampf is fine, but overpaid. I mean, Bobby McMahon is fine, right? Like it's just a lot of that. I mean, Holmberg is okay. It, there's there's nobody in this bottom six, especially if you move Jarnkrok down to the bottom six and move Domi up, that really excite me. And that's the problem, right? Like that is the issue. There's this bottom six doesn't have the same pop as like the Blake Coleman, Yanni Gourde Tampa Bay team did, right? Or as the, our Terry Lehkonen Colorado third line did. And that's the problem, right? And people are like, well, you can't find Blake Coleman's growing on trees for like $1 million. Like, well, yeah, but that's the best teams can find those guys. And Toronto hasn't found those guys, right? They're over here overpaying for Ryan Reeves in free agency. So it's like the idea, right? Like it's like the Leafs as a management philosophy are stuck in this like theory that you have to have the Ryan Reeves on your teams to win the Stanley Cup, and that's how we're going to pay them a bunch of money. But in reality, you need those depth scorers. You need those guys who can play, elite two-way games, who can drive offense, who can do things dynamically and can contribute in a positive way deep in your lineup, because teams' first lines are going to get shut down. That teams focus in on that, right? Like that's what happens. So it really, you need that depth scoring. You need those guys who can, you can throw out, right? I mean, look at like when Montreal went to the finals in the bubble in the Canadian division year, right? It was such a weird year, but like their bottom six was like huge for them in that season, right? I mean, like the Perry Armia and Eric Stahl line was fantastic in driving play. Like they generated a ton of offense. And I don't see that from this bottom six in Toronto again. And that's where my biggest concern comes in, right? Like people are going to blame the Stars, but like trading Mitch Marner doesn't solve that problem for you. You just lose one of your big weapons up front, right? Like nobody's going to trade Mitch. Nobody's going to trade their entire bottom six for Mitch Marner. So it doesn't solve your problem. And then you still have a hole up top, right? Like they still, like you look at the top six now and there's still holes in it to begin with, right? So it, it's a very interesting situation. And I don't think, right, people want to move Mitch Marner just to move Mitch Marner, but like it doesn't really help your situation unless you can get, a package back for it. And that's why he wasn't traded, right? That's why. Flipping over to this blue line, I'm a lot more optimistic about the blue line. I think they actually did a good job filling needs on this blue line. I've been tied for fifth as well. So they're top five in both offense and defense. The goaltending is where they take a hit. But we'll get into that. I mean, they're ranked sixth, so that's pretty on par with where they should be, I guess. It starts with Morgan Rielly, and again, Morgan Rielly's become a scapegoat for this team in a lot of ways, but he's still a very solid defenseman. I think they've added stability around him this summer, and I think that's going to help. But again, it's just about if they can play these guys properly. Chris Tanev is a guy who over the last couple of years has really, really developed into that high end defensive defenseman. And it's weird because like with age, he's kind of become that player. And it's been a really fascinating rise for Tanev. And if he can find that again in Toronto, if he can rekindle that in Toronto and become, this elite defensive defenseman, then that's a huge addition to this team, especially with the goaltending situation they're in right now. I think that's going to help. I mean, the Leafs kind of have to find ways to creatively win hockey games. Um, and if Chris Tanev's going to be out there and playing at a high end, one of the best defensemen in the league level, that'll be really helpful. And it will and if they do end up playing with Morgan Riley for the season, it might allow Morgan Riley to find more of an offensive game, right? Like he'll be less concerned with trying to, cover up his deficiencies defensively. And, maybe we see a more offensive season from Morgan Riley than what we've been seeing the last couple of years. I think that's kind of the hope, right? Moving down this lineup, Oliver Ekman-Larsson has kind of had another resurgence. I mean, he looked really good in Florida, and again, he was behind a exceptional blue line, especially last year. So expecting him to, maybe take on a slightly bigger role here, being like the fifth best defenseman on this team, he should be fine, right? Like they're not going to ask him to do a whole lot. Timothy Liljegren's somebody I really like. I've been a Liljegren fan for a while. Just play him more. Let him really pop off. Same with Jake McCabe. Another guy who's just kind of a two-way, good puck mover. Really good transition defenseman. Both him and Liljegren kind of fit that bill. And then you have Benoit, who actually had a decent showing at the end of last season, but again, he says your sixth defenseman, you can't really complain about that. So overall, like this blue line is pretty strong. I think the biggest question for me is just if Morgan Riley can kind of find that next gear offensively, and maybe playing with a Chris Tanev allows him to be less defensively focused. Um, and maybe that allows, the offense to get a bit more dynamic from him. And, you move throughout this roster, right? Like at Oliver Ekman-Larsson, he's got the Stanley Cup and everybody loves that, but he's still a super useful defenseman. And now that he doesn't have the massive contract hanging over his head, that should kind of help him gain more extra, like become more of a valuable player. And that's kind of one of those guys, right? Where I feel like this forward core kind of lacks those bargain bin better than their contract value players. Defensively, Toronto's got a couple of them, and Oliver Ekman-Larsson should be one of those for sure. But overall, like I think it's a really solid blue line. My only other concern is just age, right? Like Tanev's old, Ekman-Larsson's old. You could get some regression from those guys, but hopefully it's not massive for that team. Finally, in net, this tandem ranks tied for 22nd, and Joseph Woll looked really solid before the injury, and obviously he stepped in the playoffs and looked really good as well. So he's somebody I have high expectations for, but I just couldn't go higher than a C just because of the playing time. There just wasn't enough. There wasn't enough there for me to feel good about putting him higher than that. And then Stolarz, who I talked about already, with the games played, caps and stuff in Florida, has been one of, if not the best pure backups in the league. But again, like we need to see him play with a larger role, and he's going to get that in Toronto, right? Like he's not going to be sitting back playing 20 25 games a year against easy opponents. It's going to be he's going to have to take on more responsibility this year, and if he can be stable with that, then it looks like a really good signing. That's why I still have him listed as the backup, even though he's a higher grade, because I actually Joseph Woll is going to be the starter, and this is a tandem that I'm excited for because I think it's got a lot of potential. It just has to but it also could go really bad because if Joseph Woll can't bring back if last year was just a flash in the pan and he can't take another step up and Stolarz can't handle the higher workload, then this could really fall apart. But it could also work really well. So it's very much one of those, it's a super influx goalie tandem. But I like the idea behind it. I think, it's a low salary risk tandem. And for a team like this, they need that. But yeah, that's all I got for this one. Thank you for watching, and make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video. Let me know what you think of the Leafs in the comments down below.